Hello, my name is Dylan Mraz. Before I start, I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of you for coming, as well as thanking my professor, Lauren Fogel, as well as Channing Howard and the Newbury Historic Commission for allowing me to be here and speak about one of my greatest passions and the things that I'm very passionate about. So thank you very much. What we know about Vikings is essentially a lot of what we know is just rumors. Many of the things that we know about them come from people who interacted with them at the time, such as there are many Christian documents that speak about Vikings being barbarians and raiders and just very violent people. Some of the images that we kind of associate with Vikings tend to be 19th century Wagner-esque kind of operatic singers with horned helmets and with long golden braided hair, and it's not necessarily true. So my goal right now today is to kind of educate you and teach you about kind of who Vikings really were, what they did, where they come from, and just take you through kind of a daily life of the Vikings. To understand about Vikings, we first have to understand where they came from. They came from the region north of Europe called Scandinavia, which incorporated modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Those areas were very, very harsh and cold. Winter, majority of the year, Vikings were typically farmers. And because of the location, there were many mountainous regions that took up a lot of the landscape. And because there was so much cold and snow and frost, farming areas were very few and far in between. Mostly what they could farm was along the coast in very sparse areas. So farming was very much a privilege. Lots of people had to hunt and gather and fish to make ends meet, which is kind of what drove Vikings to later raid, which we'll talk about later on. So, there was no united Viking people back in the day during the 8th century when they first kind of entered the historical textbooks. The lands were not, they were not united. There was no Norway. There was no people of Sweden. There was no people of Denmark. They were just North people. They were Norsemen and women. The areas that they inhabited were broken into small kind of kingdoms led by a local earl they called a jarl. This person would be proven in combat. He'd be very strong and able to kind of lead his people all together. And they were as different from each other as they were from everyone else they met and came into contact with. Much of what we know about the Viking laws we kind of have to base on what we know from Iceland, which I'll explain a little bit later on. Viking law, typically, it was actually very democratic. They would meet at these things that were called Althings, which is a gathering of the free people of the Viking villages. They would meet before a council that was elected to serve a certain amount of years, and they would all come forth to speak for a couple of days about the goings-on of the area. If they had disputes with neighbors about land or property or farming or cattle or anything like that, they would bring it up before the council, and both parties would kind of speak their minds and say what was going on, and then the council would kind of decide what course of action they would take. Vikings did not have a written history. Everything they did was passed on orally. And because of this, swearing oaths was a very important part of Viking life and Viking law. When they would swear on their arm rings, which kind of bound them to their kings, it was taken very seriously. It was essentially swearing on your life. If someone was to break these laws, it would be punished severely, and in their afterlife, they would be sent to a place called Hell, which we're sort of familiar with. There's a difference between Viking, or what was considered a crime amongst the Viking people now and or back then, and what we kind of consider a crime now. Typical things, such as murder or theft, it was considered, a bad thing and would be punished, but there were different degrees. Vikings were very honor bound, and they were very kind of proud folk. And so that kind of established itself in its laws as well. If someone was to commit a crime like, say, theft, if someone broke into your house and stole from you, it would be different than someone coming up to you and robbing you, because it would be considered kind of lowly and sneaky and would go behind someone's back, and that was considered disgraceful and cowardly and would be punished more severely. In the case of murder, it would only be considered murder if you didn't tell anybody about it. In Viking law, you were able to pass by 3 houses, but no more, and tell someone by then, or speak to the first person you met on the street and say, I killed Bjorn, or I killed Ragnar or something, and it would be considered manslaughter, and you would only pay a certain amount of coin as compensation to the family. If you hid your crime, it was considered, again, cowardly, and it would be, if you were caught, there would be a greater punishment. It could go between all kinds of things. A typical Viking punishment in the law would be something called running a gauntlet, where the accused, the criminal, would run in between 2 lines of people, where they would all throw stones and fruit and anything they kind of could get their hands on at you, until you either made it past everyone or fell to the ground. Of course, Vikings also had the death penalty, and crimes could range all throughout the scale, whether it be a beheading, running a gauntlet, or just paying a small tithe or a compensation. Religion, as we'll get to next. The Vikings were polytheistic, which means they worshipped many gods. They regularly practiced ancestor worship, because they had such an honor-bound code. They kind of believed in the honor of their forefathers, and their ancestors kind of strengthened them as they kind of went through life. This is an example of their chief god, Odin. He is the All-Father. He is the father of the gods. He rules the pantheon of gods in Asgard, which is essentially their version of heaven. He's the god of battle, as well as of poetry and war. He's very powerful, but he's also very wise. They had a book called the Hamnaval, which is the sayings of the High One, and they would kind of talk about it and read it as for its words of wisdom and its suggestions. Despite him being the uppermost and most important god, Thor was the most popular. Thor is considered just the regular man's god, where Odin is the god of nobility and kings. Thor is the god of the people, of the farmers, of the everyday person. He is the thunderer god, the god of thunder and lightning. He controlled the elements. He protected man. This was who most people looked up to. He wields a hammer known as Mjolnir, which is what he used to call down lightning. Many devoted people would carry pendants in the shape of hammers and wear them around their neck as a symbol of devotion. He is definitely the most popular god amongst the pantheon. The third most important god is known as Frey, or Freyr. He is the god of fertility. He was considered very beautiful. He was invoked when people would become married or wedded, as well as if crops were doing poorly, they would, ask Frey to kind of bless their crops and make them become more fertile lands, so to speak. The Vikings believed in what we could kind of call a multiverse, which is a series of different worlds where different elements and different people lived that were all connected by what's called Yggdrasil, the world tree. Now, in each of these different worlds, a different person lived, and the gods lived in the very top, known as Asgard. There were also another equal but different set of gods known as the Vanir gods, who lived in Vanaheim. The land of men is Midgard, which is in the middle here. And then Niflheim and Hel are in the lower parts, in the lower branches and the roots. It was possible to kind of travel between these, but of course, you had to take part in kind of magical rites to enable to get through it. When they saw a rainbow, they believed it was a magical bridge that the gods used to get from their dwellings in Asgard to the dwellings of men in Midgard. They believed when someone died, if they were very noble and strong of will and heart and courageous, their souls would be brought to Asgard, and they would serve the gods there as warriors for them in the halls of Valhalla. You might have heard that before. If you were less courageous, if you broke oaths or murdered or stole, you would be sent to hell, which is not exactly the fire and brimstone version we know, but it was just more of a very foreboding, dark, dank place that nobody would like to be, and you'd have to serve the goddess Hel, who lived there. Funerals were very important in a Viking life. We don't have many examples of corpses or bones of bodies because typically Vikings burned their fallen brothers and sisters. They would light them on pyres because they believed that by burning them, the flames and the smoke would make them rise to the heavens faster than if you just buried them. However, it was very typical for a kind of higher up someone in the aristocracy to be buried, such as a king or a seer, as they called them, kind of someone who was very in touch with nature or someone very well respected. And they were not just simply buried in a tomb or in a coffin. What they did was they dug a large hole and took one of their own Viking longships, and they buried the king or the chieftain or the seer in these longships, along with all kinds of personal possessions. We were able to identify these throughout the area of Scandinavia by locating large mounds that are kind of unnatural almost. We're able to excavate these, and we actually found several examples of these buried longships. One example is one of the ones we found in Oslo. As you can see, the vast scale of it, these ships are very long, sometimes exceeding 100 feet long, and they were very narrow. The fallen person, the deceased, would be placed in these ships on the decks, oftentimes buried with their own slaves. And the people of the surrounding area would kind of give gifts to them that they would think they would need in the afterlife, such as containers and barrels, cooking supplies, weapons, toiletries, anything really. Many of these are excavated, and we have them in museums fully restored to the best of our abilities. As you can see, they're fantastically amazing to see. Oftentimes they were also set out to sea and burned as well, depending. We don't really know why some were burned and why some were buried. There's no real knowing for sure because they didn't write their history down. One of the famous examples, and I believe this ship, is actually from a lady who was believed to be a kind of magician, I guess you could call her. DNA testing on her bones and on her on the stuff that was left behind kind of showed that she had some DNA deformities. They believe she was injured as a child and kind of walked with a hunch and a cane, and also she suffered from I'm not sure what you would call it, but she essentially she would have very differing hormones, and she was actually able to grow a beard and such like that. So it's speculated that they might have thought because of this, because she was able to grow a beard and such, that she was kind of one with nature and had control over both genders and the elements. So she was very well respected and probably feared as well. In the example of her burying, which is this ship, she was buried with a slave who would serve her in the afterlife, as well as we found various examples of slaughtered oxen and horses that were also given to her from the neighboring community. The whole burial would take the entire village months to complete. they would drag the ships up onto land away from the oceans where they might be taken in if they were buried or damaged, and they would dig these meters deep, as you can see, just incredibly deep into the ground, and they would then take the whole thing and set it in and bring the corpses down into the ship and then pile it with grave goods and all these belongings, and then they would take the whole thing and bury it with stones and dirt and make a giant mound over it. It was a very elaborate, intricate process that would take months and months of work from dozens and dozens of people. Also times, what would happen is if someone was burned and they were important, or if they were out raiding or just traveling and they died then, what would happen is they would set up what is called a rune stone. These rune stones were made, and they mention, they essentially say that, this person asked this person to erect this rune stone to honor their brother, sister, wife, husband, this person who did this deed. And it was just a very short summary of kind of who they were, where they came from, and what they did. These were either erected in terms of when someone died or passed away on travel, or if someone made a great accomplishment, such as the Jelling Stone found in Denmark. This specific one marks the deed of Harold Bluetooth, who was able to unite Denmark and make the entire nation Christian. Now this is a very important thing because typically we think of Vikings as very ferociously pagan warriors who are kind of, very stalwart in their ways and very set in the old traditions. And this is true. Early attempts to kind of Christianize, the Vikings did not go exactly as was planned. Originally what happened was they would recognize Jesus as a god, but they wouldn't recognize him as the only god. They thought of him as a lesser god in the pantheon, but not among the chiefs. So they would worship him, but they would also worship Odin and Thor and Frey and Loki and all these other gods along with him. And Harold Bluetooth was a leader of the Vikings in Denmark around the early 900s. And he actually went on a campaign to bring Christ into power and make him the only god. And this is the very first example we've ever seen of a depiction of Christ by the Vikings. This shows him as a very powerful person, kind-hearted, but also very physically strong. Not typically what we see in examples of later on from the Renaissance, or kind of what we're used to now, where he's kind of kinder and frail looking almost. This kind of made him into a strong figure, which is something the Vikings could kind of get behind and feel good about, because originally he was viewed as very passive and kind, which is not something that they were used to when they were kind of forced to go out and fight. And their gods were gods of war and gods of battle and protection, who carried large hammers and weapons with them. On top of being farmers and warriors, Vikings were also traders. When they would set out on raids, it was not uncommon for them to suddenly stop and call a truce for them to set up shop and sell their goods. Yes, these were also goods that they had previously stolen from the people, and they would sell them back, and then once the trades were done, they would steal them again. However, this is just a map that shows you just how far spread the Vikings were. While their prime settlements were in northern Scandinavia, they did make their way quite far all throughout Europe. The Vikings from Denmark typically focused around the areas of England and then along the northern shores of mainland Europe. The Vikings from Sweden worked east into what is now Finland and Russia, and eventually went down as far as Constantinople to the Byzantine Empire, where some of them actually went on to serve as personal guards to the Byzantine king. The Norwegian Vikings originally followed along the coast of Scotland and Ireland, but between conflicts between them and the Danish Vikings, they went more westwards towards Iceland and Greenland and North America. Viking goods were very sought after because they were so strange to the people and because they were also kind of hard to get their hands on. Typically, Vikings would sell furs and pelts, leather goods, weapons, ivory from walruses along their coasts, which was not seen anywhere else. So these goods were very sought after and desired. One big export the Vikings had was slaves. When Vikings would raid, they would take some people back with them who they thought could serve a purpose, because Vikings were first and foremost farmers. And so as farmers, you need lots of help to cultivate the fields, especially in the tough, frozen lands that they lived in. So slaves were a large commodity and they were very common. They could be anywhere. It didn't matter where they came from, what religion they practiced, what they looked like. If you were there and they had you, you were a slave now. They would be used for their farms, just extra farmhands. As they were slaves, they had very little rights, but they could earn their freedom if they became friendly with the families or proven themselves as obedient servants, or maybe even converted if they were Christian or another religion. They could be given freedom, and they could be free to live amongst the Vikings and go on raids with them or trade with them or travel. Depends. So yes. The raiding that we know of started in 796. That was the first documented raid of the Vikings, and that was their first entry into the textbooks. This started on an island called Lindisfarne, which is off the coast of England in the northeast, kind of around Scotland. Lindisfarne was a small monastery island. In this picture, there's a castle. It was built in the 1600s, but this is still where it was. There's lots of speculation on why the Vikings raided. Typically, Vikings would raid because they needed supplies, they needed food, or they wanted wealth. And all of those can be attributed to Lindisfarne. The Vikings came, they came quickly, they came without warning, they surprised everyone, nobody knew what to do, they had little time to prepare any kind of defenses, and they slaughtered. Anybody who stood in their way or tried to kind of defend themselves were either cut down and killed or taken with them back to Scandinavia, used as slaves. While they were here, they pillaged and took all the gold from the church, and there was quite a lot of it because there were lots of golden crosses and gems and just lots of things that were of worth that were in the church. So that's how the raiding first started. When they found, this is an example of a Viking raid, when they found that churches stored lots of high worth things, lots of valuables, they became frequent sites of Viking raids because they were easy targets. They were not well defended. They had all the items right out in the open, so they would come in, attack, take what they needed, and then leave. There are some instances where the churches were burned, but this is typically not the case because that would mean that the church would have to be rebuilt before they could be restocked. If you think about it, practically, if you left it alone, it could be restocked quicker and they could come back sooner and steal more from you. Viking raiding eventually went all throughout Europe. There are lots of different kind of instances of raids all throughout, going down from England and Scotland and Ireland to Europe, to the Holy Roman Empire, down to Sweden, down to Spain and Portugal, into Constantinople. They went very far. As I said earlier, the Swedish Vikings typically went east and down through Russia to the Byzantine Empire. The Danish Vikings focused mostly on England and were actually able to carve a large chunk of territory they called the Danegeld, which is where they actually settled and established a kind of permanent fixture. The Norwegian Vikings, to avoid the Danish, focused along the northern coast by Scotland, Ireland, and then went further westwards. This typically happened in the early 900s. In Scandinavia, in Norway specifically, there was a Viking king. His name was Harald Fairhair. He set out to unite Norway under one monarchy. in those days, Vikings didn't really know what a monarchy was. What they knew of monarchies, they knew of them from Europe, and they were typically associated with Christian philosophies and Christian ideals and Christian kingdoms, because that was what they were used to seeing. And while this could be very powerful for the monarchy, it was very frightening. It was a very frightening idea for the people, because they saw this as kind of the Christianization of their whole collective settlements. As they believed in ancestor worship, they thought their ancestors were kind of watching over them and watching what they did, and they didn't want to disrespect that. So many of them actually fled, and they set up encampments further west in Iceland. Iceland is one of the most important areas that the Vikings owned, because the reason it was established was kind of a way to hold on to their old traditions and their old ways. And so that's why many things that we get from Iceland, such as the laws and the sagas that we get, we can attribute to the earlier settlements and civilizations of the Vikings, because it was all based around things they would have done in the years before, before any kind of Christian contact came into being. And they would eventually travel further west into Greenland and North America. One of the greatest things from Iceland was the poet Snorri Sturluson. He was in the 1300s, the 1200s, but what he did, despite being a Christian himself, he cataloged and recorded all of the old sagas and all of the stories that would be told to the families, and he collected them and wrote them down into a series of books. And it's because of him and other people like him we know anything about the Vikings. A few examples of the works he wrote are these, Saga of the Icelanders, which is a collective history of the people of Iceland that extends to Greenland in the Greenland Saga. The Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda are both very long, elaborate poems, each filled with their own sections and books that depict all kinds of fables and the stories we hear of Vikings, of their gods, of their ways, of the heroes such as Sigurd, the dragon slayer, and all kinds of things. Heimskringla is one of the examples of the histories that they wrote down. It's a record of all of the kings of Norway back as far as you can imagine. It's how we know anything about the Vikings now and kind of who they were. Let me go back actually. So in 980, there was a man in Iceland, and his name was Eric the Red. Don't know if you've heard of him. He's the reason why the Vikings continued to go west from Iceland. He was a bit hot-headed, a bit hot-tempered. He got into a fight one day with his neighbor over property, over land, the borrowing of farm tools or something, killed him. And so because of this, he was forced to kind of go to a further settlement out in the western lands, less populated in Iceland. There, the same exact thing happens. He got in a fight with his neighbor, killed him, and was forced to leave again. And so he had heard rumors of land being further west. So he took his family and some friends and followers, and he took his ships and he sailed west and discovered Greenland. He named it Greenland so that more people would come. He wanted people to believe that it was a beautiful land full of opportunity and fields for plowing, and just a perfect place for Vikings to live. And this wasn't necessarily the thing. While Greenland was great in its own respect, there was no native forests or trees. All their timber had to be imported from Iceland. It was extremely cold. I think average winter temperatures was in the -40s-ish. So the wood that they were actually able to import, they used to build houses with very low ceilings where you'd have to hunch over to kind of conserve heat. Their barns for their animals, they would build as extensions onto their houses. Typically they'd be built further off to kind of separate, but they wanted to build them closer so that they could get all the heat from the animals into their homes, kind of warm themselves. They had to rely on hunting whale for their fat to make lamps and for their meat, obviously. But it's a very unforgiving land, very much what they were used to. And despite naming Greenland, not many people wanted to come and visit because it was a bit of a trek. His son, Leif Erikson, as we might have heard, had similar ideals to his father and took his own ships and set out further west again to kind of try to find the ideal Viking place to live. It was him that discovered the land of Vinland, he called it, which was a beautiful land, the perfect land, you might say. It was very luscious, it was very green, it was plenty of forest lands, lots of great fields. It was the Viking ideal. This is the map, supposedly, of Vinland that rumor has was made around the time. There had been some testing on it, and there's actually a documentary about it. They're pretty sure it's not real, but it's still a great thing to look at. This is the settlement in Vinland. It is in Newfoundland, so it's not that far away. And it's the only example we have of a Viking settlement established in North America. The reason why we believe the Vikings couldn't stay here is because although it was a perfect place that they had all been looking for, it was very moderate temperature-wise, what they were used to at least. Lots of luscious fields and forests and plenty of fishing with giant salmon. They couldn't retain the area, and that was for several reasons. One was because nobody wanted to make the very long trek all the way from Europe across the sea to North America. It would take months to get there. You might not live. It was too much of a high-risk endeavor. Another reason was because of the native people of the area didn't trust the Vikings. I wonder why. There would be constant raids against the Vikings, written in the Greenland Saga. The native people would come in and attack them at night. There weren't enough people to defend the area, so deaths were high, and because of this, they had to abandon their settlements. They would visit it every once in a while, but it was very uncommon. There just weren't enough people to kind of make it a solid foundation, a solid foothold in the area, despite it being kind of an ideal living situation. So what does this mean about Vikings in North America? We know they came here, but we don't really know much beyond that. There's lots of rumors that I'm sure you're aware of Viking rune stones being discovered all around the area, and that's true. There are lots of rumors. There are many examples. There's a couple rune stones that were found in Byfield here. There's another one in Hampton. There's a large burial mound in West Virginia, which is very typical of a Viking funerary mound. It was actually excavated in 1838, and at the very base of it, there were 2 corpses found that were buried with a multitude of seashells and pieces of mica, and a couple slabs of stone that were carved, and there's still lots of conflicting stories about what that might be. So the Viking runes specifically, as an example of Swedish-Norwegian runes around the time of the Vikings, as you can see, they're very linear and kind of edged, and it's kind of hard to differentiate sometimes with just wearing on stone slabs. Lots of the rumors of Viking stones found in North America have kind of been attributed to glacial striation, or just kind of weathering, just because it's lots of linear cuts and lines and stuff, and it's kind of a toss-up. It's for that reason a lot of people say they didn't make it this far down, because there are no concrete settlements such as what we found in Newfoundland. All we know are kind of stones that say, this person was here, this person was there. There's no real way to prove it, sadly. But there are a lot of examples. Like I said, the mound in West Virginia, This is the Torvald stone in Hampton, New Hampshire. Supposedly Torvald was, the brother of Leif Erikson, and this is his final resting place. They're not sure why he would be so far down from Newfoundland into Hampton, but that's the rumor. I certainly don't know. A lot of people don't know. I think it's best to say possibly. There isn't enough concrete evidence found to kind of prove or disprove. It's definitely an interesting theory. I would hope it's real. I would hope that it would happen and Vikings made it this far down. But from what we have now, there's no real way to know for sure. But of course, we can always keep that thought alive. That's my presentation. Thank you. Any questions or anything interesting tidbits or?
I have a question about the runes. Do they represent letters or?
Yes, actually. Let me just talk a little bit more about that. The Viking runes, it was their language. There weren't as many letters as the English alphabet, but there's many similar sounds. Each one did represent a different letter, and you can kind of spell that out. Let me go back to the Rune Stones here. Come on. It was their alphabet. Although they were kind of illiterate, they still had these. Everything was passed down orally unless it was, some terrific deed or someone of importance or someone was able to commission a runestone made for their fallen relative or loved one or friend. But yes, it was a language. It was their alphabet that they used. There are many different variations all throughout the several hundred years that they kind of existed in history. There are several different examples of alphabets from different areas, and oftentimes they would all be blended together. So kind of an alphabet from the 700s would also be used with letters and elements of rune script from the 1100s. So it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint when things were made and such and such, unless it specifically mentioned a date. I don't think many runestones did. The gelling stone, I believe, did, because it commemorated his achievement at that point and kind of used the Christian calendar from the Holy Roman Empire. But yes.
Sorry, I was going to, in that slide, does that go, the picture you showed with kind of the cross, does that go up and around it? I can't see.
Yeah.
It looks like it curves.
Yeah, in Viking runes, there was no kind of formal, left to right, top to bottom. It just kind of snaked around wherever they could fit in runes. The runes are reversible as well as directionless. In this one, because it kind of snakes its way around back and forth. So the runes could actually be read this way and then upside down and then back again. There's a little coordination within the runes. They just kind of fit it however way they could, essentially.
Where's that stone that's in Hampton?
That is actually by the Tuck Museum, right on the road. It's kind of right in their backyard, so to speak. It's only 15 minutes from here, I think. So you can just drive up and kind of check it out. I've looked it over and I can't quite see any runes, but I'm no expert on rune script.
What about on the Isles of Shoals, the ruins? Was that on the Isles of Shoals there? That was supposedly attributed to the Vikings.
Yeah, a lot of places were attributed to the Vikings, as well as the Shetland Islands and the Orkney Islands by Scotland.
Because you'd expect, they say that by ship you're more apt to find them, coastal.
Yeah, and typically from what we know and from settlements and examples of what we found, they did settle on the coast because that's where they lived, that's what they knew. They didn't really move too far inland unless they had to. An actually interesting fact, as in Scotland in the 2000s, in 2000, there was a DNA testing done in this big kind of thing called Blood of the Vikings, and they wanted to test and see kind of how extensive Vikings, implanted and kind of interspersed and intermarried in the area. and testing done on the males there showed anywhere from 60 to 100% had DNA matches back to people from Norway. And then they did a more specific one on families who were there for more than 3 generations, and that showed 100% that their families had come from Norway. So it kind of shows just how well they interspersed. But yeah, they settled along coastal regions mostly.
That particular excavation of the longboat,
Yes?
is that the most recent, or has there been many since then? And what areas?
There have been various excavations. This one was done in the early 900s, or 1900s, I mean.
Yep.
But they kind of discover them all the time, a lot. A lot of the time they're not able to be put back together like this one because they were just made of wood, so they would kind of wear away or become warped, and beams would snap and they wouldn't be able to be repaired. But some of the bigger ones, surprisingly, they've been able to excavate fully and kind of put back together. There was a big revival of kind of Viking history in the early 1900s, the late 1800s, and that's when a lot of them were discovered and kind of reassembled. And since then, they've treated the ones they found then with modern ways of kind of protecting them to make sure they wouldn't further rot or slow down the aging process. But I think most of the ones discovered were in the early, anywhere from like 1900 to 1930-ish time frame.
And most all of them in that area?
Yeah, almost all the ones we found are along the coast of Sweden, Denmark, some in Norway. Actually, where's the map? Oh, I'm going back, jeez. Come on. Most of them, I think, were found along this region, right around kind of where they all meet. I'm not really sure why, but that's where most of them were found, along the areas of Gotland. It would be amazing if we found that. As far as I know, there haven't been any found in North America, sadly. But that's, again, probably because there were so few people, so there were so few ships to kind of spare to kind of travel out and navigate the area. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Back? They were the first settlers, as far as I know. There were some instances along some of the islands where monks from Ireland had traveled to kind of find secluded areas to be closer to God and worship. But I don't think they made it as far as Iceland. And of course the Vikings discovered them and kind of influenced them to leave, I should say.
Just a thought. I don't know a lot about the climatology of northern Scandinavia, but I had the pleasure of spending some time in Denmark as well as working in Newfoundland, spending some time in Newfoundland. Really, the climate there isn't bad at all.
Really?
Yeah. The North Sea especially. I mean, Denmark is just incredible. It's like really special. I mean, I hear about the green, the Emerald Isle Islands, and so forth. It's mostly farmland, as you guys.
Oh, wow.
Like, it's really kind of cool because you have this traditional sort of lifestyle. It's very farm. There's a couple of wind turbines. Apparently Denmark has done more than probably any other country.
Yeah, the whole area of Scandinavia is very progressive in that sense. Right.
Did the Vikings really wear horns on their helmets?
No, I'm so glad you asked this. No, that is another example of kind of exaggeration. I have no idea where that came from. I think there were some kind of native Irish people who would wear ceremonial helmets for marriages or for feasting or something that had horns, but a typical Viking helmet looks like the one I have here, or a variation of such. This is called a spangle helmet because it would have a very prominent nose piece to kind of protect you from any slashes to the face. Another typical Viking look is very similar, but it's called a spectacle helmet, and it would kind of just have little eye slits here and protect the whole lower area from any wayward blows or anything like that. But there were no horns on any Viking helmets in battle. It's very practical. It would throw balance off. You could just grab a hold of it and yank them down and all kinds of things. It was
Dylan, can you say something about the origin of the word Russia and the origin of the word Normandy?
Yes. So, we all know Normandy from lots of things invading during World War II and stuff, but the reason it's named Normandy was because the Danish Vikings would kind of travel inland and attack places that the Roman Empire controlled, and of these places was northern France. And so to kind of get them to stop, what they would do is they'd pay them. They'd pay them huge amounts. They'd pay them thousands of pounds worth of silver to kind of influence them to just leave. And they would accept that, and they'd leave for a year or so until they wanted more. Because they realized that just by their presence there, it frightened everybody because they were such powerful warriors that they could just kind of show up and expect to be paid. And so one of the ways that some people tried to kind of counteract this was offer them land. It happened in England when the Danish Vikings were given what was called the Danegeld. It was their payment, where they had a little chunk of land right here that they were able to freely live in and have their own laws, so long as they didn't continue to raid outwards. Same thing happened in Normandy. The Holy Roman Empire decided to kind of give them that large chunk of northern France to the Vikings to live there and stay there. Please stay there. And so it was named Normandy, which the dy ending is a typical Danish ending for places, so essentially say like this person's place, this region. So in the native language, it would be essentially called the Northmen's land, the Northmen's area. So that's kind of where Normandy comes from. With the Rus Vikings and Russia, the Swedish Vikings would work their way into Russian land, and there were many rivers and kind of areas that they could navigate with their ships, and so they're kind of called Rus, which was the rowers, and so the whole area kind of became known as Rusland, or the rowers' land, the Viking land. And the same with Slavic areas. When the Rus Vikings would kind of travel out through Novgorod down to the Volga River and stuff, they would take these natives who lived there and kind of enslave them and capture them, and it was so common that they became known as the slave people, or the Slav people, the Slavic people.
What's the connection between the Scandinavian Vikings and the Germanic tribes? When you said they became Christian like around 900 or so? Around
the 900s, yes.
And Charlemagne was trying to convert Germanic tribes
yes.
800, so.
Yes, it's typically believed that the kind of Germanic tribes that settled in Germany and along the Gaulish region were kind of descendants of the Vikings from Scandinavia. They kind of traveled more inland in years earlier and kind of established areas there, and then kind of grew distant from one another. They had very similar gods. Their main god was Woden instead of Odin, and Thor instead of Thor. So it was all very closely related, but just different. In the case of Charlemagne, Charlemagne was very Christian. He came from the Frankish region, and he wanted to kind of make all of Europe Christian. And so his biggest opponent in that case was the Saxons, which occupied Germany, essentially. And he was very frustrated by these pagan Saxons, because he'd go there and attack and convert them, and he'd leave and come back the next year and they'd be back to their heathenish ways. So he got very embittered by that, and there were many kind of attempts on Charlemagne's life by these Saxons, because they didn't want to kind of abandon their old beliefs. And so after one particular uprising in Verdun, he captured about 4,500 Saxons and forcibly converted them before executing all of them. Because in his eyes, it would, one, scare all the other Saxons and kind of make them obey, and two, it would save the lives of these men because they were baptized and converted before they were killed, so they'd just go to heaven. This is one of the main reasons why they think original attacks and raids on England were in retaliation to the Christianization of the pagans, because the massacre of Verdun happened around 780, and the first attack on English shores happened hardly a decade after. And there were many signs of religious strife, where the church being burned, many of the monks and priests and worshippers of Christ were drowned, and they believed that this was kind of a mock baptism in their eyes to kind of get vengeance on what happened to their pagan brothers and sisters.